Chapter 5 of Part 2 of The Lives of the Three Misses Judsons, by Arabella M. Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Stationed at Maulmain. Attack of banditti. Missionary operations. Danger from fire. On consultation, it was determined that Mr. and Mrs. Wade should remain in Amherst, and that Mr. and Mrs. Boardman should proceed to Maulmain, a town 25 miles up the river, which had sprung into being in the same manner as Amherst, and was nearly as populous, and that Mr. Judson should divide his time between the two stations. In pursuance of this plan, Mr. Boardman removed his family, which had been increased by the addition of a lovely daughter, now about 5 months old, to the new city of Maulmain. On the evening of May 28th, Mr. Boardman makes this entry in his journal: "After nearly 2 years of wanderings without any certain dwelling place, we have to-day become inhabitants of a little spot of earth, and have entered a house which we call our earthly home. None but those who have been in similar circumstances can conceive the satisfaction we now enjoy. The population of the town is supposed to be 20,000. 1 year ago it was all a thick jungle without an inhabitant. While at Amherst, Mrs. Boardman had experienced an alarming attack of a disease incident to the climate, and had to be carried to the boat which conveyed her to her new home on a litter. On her arrival there, although she shared her husband's joy that at length they had a home on the long promised land of Burmah, still her woman's nature, enfeebled by suffering, could not but have trembled at the idea of living in a lonely spot, for the mission house was nearly a mile from the barracks, with the neighbouring jungle swarming with serpents that hiss and beasts of prey that howl. In addition to this cause of alarm, there was opposite them, on the Burman side of the river, the old decayed city of Martaban, which was the refuge of a horde of banditti, who, armed with knives and swords, would often sally forth in bands of 30 or 40, urge their light and noiseless boats across the river, satiate themselves with plunder and murder in the British town, and return with their spoils to their own territory, where they were secure from British retaliation. The English general, knowing the insecurity of the mission house, had urged Mr. B. to remove with his family to the protection of the fort, but his object was to benefit the Burmans, and to do that he must live among them. In their little bamboo hut, therefore, so frail that it could be cut open, as Mrs. Boardman says, with a pair of scissors, they prosecuted their study of the language under a native teacher, and even ventured to talk a little with the half-wild natives around them, and for a few weeks were unmolested. Their courage and confidence had revived, and with Mrs. B. restored health brought happiness. June 20th she writes: "We are in excellent health, and as happy as it is possible for human beings to be upon earth. It is our earnest desire to live, labor, and die among this people." With such feelings they had probably retired to rest on the night of the 24th of June, but awakening towards morning, and perceiving that the lamp which they always kept burning through the night was extinguished, they suspected mischief, and on relighting it they found to their consternation that their house had been entered by the lawless plunderers mentioned above, and robbed of nearly every valuable article it contained. But how was their horror increased by finding 2 large cuts in the moscheto curtains about their bed, through which the murderers had watched their slumbers, ready to stab them to the heart had they offered the slightest resistance, or even had they waked to consciousness. But he who giveth his beloved sleep had kindly steeped their senses in slumbers so profound and peaceful that not even the infant stirred or opened its eyes, which would have instantly been sealed again in death. Every trunk, box, and bureau was rifled. Looking glass, watch, spoons, keys were gone. And yet, as the parents glanced at those rent curtains, and thought how the death angel had grazed them with his wing as he passed by, their hearts rose in gratitude and praise to their heavenly deliverer. But Mrs. Boardman's feelings are best told in her own expressive words. She says: "After the first amazement had a little subsided, I raised my eyes to the curtains surrounding our bed, and to my indescribable emotion saw 2 large holes cut, the one at the head and the other at the foot of the place where my dear husband had been sleeping. From that moment I quite forgot the stolen goods, and thought only of the treasure that was spared. In imagination I saw the assassins with their horrid weapons standing by our bedside, ready to do their worst had we been permitted to awake. Oh, how merciful was that watchful Providence which prolonged those powerful slumbers of that night, not allowing even the infant at my bosom to open its eyes at so critical a moment. If ever gratitude glowed in my bosom, if ever the world appeared to me worthless as vanity, and if ever I wished to dedicate myself, my husband, my babe, my all, to our great Redeemer, it was at that time. To this day not a trace of our goods has been found, leaving no doubt that they were taken immediately over the river to Martaban. Since our loss we have received many kind presents from our friends, so that we now find ourselves comfortable, and we are contented and happy. Yes, my beloved friend, I think I can say that notwithstanding our alarms, never did 5 months of my life pass as pleasantly as the last 5 have done. The thought of being among this people whom we have so long desired to see, and the hope that God would enable me to do some little good to the poor heathen, has rejoiced and encouraged my heart. I confess that once or twice my natural timidity has, for a moment, gained ascendancy over my better feelings, and at the hour of midnight, when the howlings of wild beasts have been silenced by the report of a musket near us, we would say to each other, perhaps the next attack will be made upon us, and the next charge may be aimed at our bosoms. Then I have been almost ready to exclaim, oh, for one little room of such materials that we could, as far as human means go, sleep in safety. But these fears have been transitory, and we have generally been able to place our confidence in the great Shepherd of Israel, who never slumbers or sleeps, assured that he would protect us. And we have also felt a sweet composure in the reflection that God has marked out our way, and if it best accord with his designs that we fall prey to these bloodthirsty monsters, all will be right. The English, hearing of this robbery, stationed a guard at the mission house of 2 sepoys, or native soldiers. As one of these was sitting in the veranda, a wild beast from the jungle sprang furiously upon him, but he was frightened away before the man was much injured. Such occurrences, however, were rare, and did not make Mrs. Boardman desire, all things considered, to change her residence. She was in the place of her choice, the country of her adoption. She had a faithful and loving husband, and a lovely and almost idolized babe. Their house, though small and insecure, was beautifully situated, with everything in the natural landscape around to charm her cultivated eye and taste. These were her earthly comforts. Besides, even the insecurity of her habitation was daily diminishing, for houses were constantly springing up around them, and more of the jungle was cleared and cultivated. But what gave its chief zest to her life, and that of her spiritually minded husband, was the fact that they found here a field of usefulness in the only work that seemed to them worth living for. From various motives the natives began to visit them constantly, and in increasing numbers, to inquire concerning the new religion. Mr. B. held a religious service on the Sabbath, and opened a school for boys, Mrs. Boardman one for girls, and both conversed as well as they were able with their numerous visitors, and employed all their leisure in mastering the language. On the 22nd of July they commemorated together the Saviour's dying love in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. A solitary pair, yet not so, for the Master of the feast was there to bless the two who thus gathered together in his name. The population at Maulmain was now increasing, and that at Amherst diminishing so rapidly that Mr. Judson and Mr. and Mrs. Wade thought best to remove from the latter situation to the former, and arrived at Maulmain in October. 2 houses of public worship were erected during the year, where Messrs. Judson and Wade were daily employed in proclaiming religious truth, and such was their success that within a few months they admitted to the church several native members. As many native converts with their families had removed with the missionaries from Amherst to Maulmain, Mrs. Wade and Mrs. Boardman united their schools into one, which was attended with the most gratifying success. Mong Shua Ba and Mong Ing, who have often been mentioned in the former memoir, read the Scriptures and other religious books to all who would hear, at a sort of reading zayat, built for the purpose. In March 1828 our friends were delivered from a danger not unknown in our own country. One evening they were startled by a roaring like that of flame, and on going to the door discovered the whole jungle to the eastward of them enveloped in a sheet of flame, which was rapidly approaching their frail cottage. Seeing no hope that their house could escape, they rapidly collected a few valuables, and with their infant prepared to flee towards the river, though in much terror lest their path should be beset by leopards, tigers, and other animals driven from their haunts by the fire. But when within a few feet of the houses, the flames were arrested by a sudden change of the wind, and the dwellings were unhurt. Thus again we are preserved, says Mr. B., when no human arm could have saved us. Truly, the hosts of God encamp round the dwellings of the just. Truly, the Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly. End of chapter 5.